I'm Mike Micah, president of Digital Eclipse, and I'm here to talk about the remastering of Karateka. How do you pronounce the game? That's I and honestly, ultimately, it's up to Jordan, and Jordan pronounces it, and I might get this wrong, but he pronounces it Karateka. Karateka is one of my favorite games of all time. I've even tried to port the game probably 33 years ago now, I think, when I was still in high school, to the Commodore Amiga. So for me, it was a lot of unfinished business. I wanted to get back to porting Karateka. And approaching this project, one of the things that kind of excited me and interested me most was why, outside of the holy trinity of versions of Karateka, did all the other ports just suck? And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that people didn't really understand it, or didn't have the source code, or they were just in a completely different frame of mind for this sort of game. Without specifically calling out certain platforms and certain games, what really kind of stood out to me is that people who tried to port Karateka previously approached it in a way that was very common back in the day. Very simple gameplay, very state-driven, the antithesis of cinematic, which is kind of the purpose of Karateka. It's meant to be a movie you play. And their approach was to take a game and make it feel more arcadey and feel very immediate. And as a result, it was just very unnatural and very, very hard to play. Really scroll it very quickly. But it was also a really iconic moment in the game, because when you arrive at the castle, you meet the guard and there's the gate, and that's just like every screenshot of the old Karateka game is pretty much that. Draw it, it's not where that shot, so it could show it back. So I see that somebody's arrived, and so I was able to capture that moment too. If I approach this as it being just a modern PC remaster, that's already been done. There was already another Karateka that was kind of a modern take on Karateka. My fascination sat with the idea that I wanted to figure out what the obstacles were to people who were porting the game. The approach to the animation in the newer version of Karateka had to be very delicately handled, because we did not want to remove or change any of the keyframes of the original game. By doing that, it suddenly wasn't Karateka anymore. It really had to be his father, and everything else that he rotoscoped had to stay retained in there. So what we had to do then was to make sure that those were retained, but everything in between had to be an interpolation. And we could have just used AI, we could have used any other ways to generate that animation, but it just didn't look natural. So the best approach was literally going in by hand and figuring out the weight and the distance and the travel of every bit of motion, and look at those frames back and forth until you could figure out a trajectory for the in-between frames, and just by hand draw those frames in. And thankfully, the game doesn't have a lot of color. Even the new version doesn't have a lot of color. So that reduced the amount of work. You can hide a lot of detail in the white of his gi. And the other costumes in the game have a lot of solid color space. So you can hide a lot of movement there and insinuate movement without doing much. So it really just kind of worked out.